Hi all. The prospect of being confined to our homes until the end of July probably feels like a life sentence just about now. So let's learn how to cope from the example of Paul, who was in a real prison. This is what he has to say in Philippians chapter 1, verse 12 to 26. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, and I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet, what shall I choose? I do not know. I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your boasting in Christ will abound on account of me. The Apostle Paul is in prison. He is about to be tried before Caesar, and it is quite possible that he would be executed. And yet, he is rejoicing. Mind you, he's not trying to put up a front so he could impress us. He is being honest and transparent. And just so we are clear, Paul wasn't necessarily happy. He had joy. According to one scholar, Paul's joy is not the self-satisfied delight that everything is going our way, but the settled peace that arises from making the gospel the focus of life and from understanding that God is able to advance the gospel under the most difficult circumstances. And frankly, this is the attitude that God seems to be teaching us right now through our enforced confinement. Paul could rejoice despite greater hardship than ours, because his reason for living was that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul's lifelong goal of glorifying Christ might sound strange to you and me, but he has actually captured what it means to be truly human, the way God intended us to be. See, we were designed to find our pleasure and ultimate satisfaction in a loving and obedient relationship with God. As the New City Catechism would put it, God created us male and female in His own image to know Him, love Him, live with Him, and glorify Him. And it is right that we who were created by God should live to His glory. Now, some of you might think that living to glorify God would be restrictive and boring. But that is how Jesus lived. And Jesus lived the most fully human life by obeying God in every way. He even died for us because He loved the Father and He desired to glorify Him by fulfilling His grand plan of redemption. Jesus found pleasure and fulfillment in the delight of His Father. And Paul is following the example of Jesus, so he has joy even while he is in prison. Now, that's not Paul on his own. Paul acknowledges that he is able to do this with the help of the Holy Spirit. Because of the Spirit's work in his life, Paul is experiencing the freedom of being truly human, one who finds delight in God being exalted. Paul rejoiced because he could see that God was using his imprisonment to advance the gospel. He rejoices in the sovereignty of God who works all things out according to his glorious purposes. Paul, being in prison, allowed him to preach the gospel to the Roman soldiers who were guarding him. And his fellow believers were being emboldened by his imprisonment to share the gospel, even if some of them had selfish reasons. As a servant of Christ, the proclamation of Christ and the strengthening of the believers were his priorities. It wasn't about his fame, it wasn't about his brand. He was willing to undergo anything and everything for the sake of the progress of the gospel. And so he was able to rejoice. As a servant of the Lord, Paul acknowledged God's right to use him as he pleased, wherever he pleased. So he even joyfully accepts his imprisonment because Paul knew he was put there for the defense of the gospel. And he left the question of his survival up to the Lord, acknowledging the primacy and superiority of God's plans and purposes. He also eagerly welcomes the prospect of his continuing ministry, even if he would rather die and be with God. Either way, what mattered most to Paul was that Christ would be honored, whether it be by his continued ministry or by his death. Now, the trouble with us is we often think we know better than God how, when, and where we should be used. Frankly, though, we rarely have an accurate understanding of our abilities. Neither do we see the scope of God's purposes. For all of Paul's gifts and abilities, he humbly viewed himself as an instrument of God, fulfilling the role God had graciously given to him. So he rendered joyful obedience to the one who is his master. He understands and embraces his servanthood because he knows and trusts Jesus Christ. And why would we not submit to the authority of Jesus? After all, Jesus is the one who loved us and gave himself for us. And I've said this before, if he loved us enough to die for us, are not his plans meant for our greatest good? And since he is far wiser than we are and knows us better than we know ourselves, are not his plans superior to ours? And since our lives are a gracious gift from him, then should we not live for his glory, even when we are confined to our homes and frustrated? So till tomorrow, let us, like Paul, make the exaltation of Christ the primary goal of our lives, because this is what it means to be truly human. And this is the way we would find real, lasting joy, the kind of joy God intends for you and me.